So hello and welcome to the SAIF Wellbeing Podcast with me, Katie, and I am delighted today to be joined by Terry Tennens, who is our SAIF Chief Executive. Am I saying that right? Yeah, excellent. So Terry, thank you very much for joining me today. But before we get into, things and just having a chat and a conversation today, who is Terry Tennens and who is Terry of SAIF that we all know?
Great. Well, it's really good to be with you, Katie, and thank you for this opportunity. Who am I is a profound question that my wife, who's a psychotherapist, is still trying to figure out. My work role is as chief executive of NOW, which is the largest trade body for funeral directors with over 1,000 members, and I've been doing that for 8 years or more, and it's a great privilege. I am father to 2 sons, which is a great joy, and I, enjoy sport, as I know you do. I like to think of myself as a reasonable thinker, practitioner on this whole area of wellness and well-being. I take what I do quite seriously in my work role. I really am quite passionate about the small to medium-sized independent who is often the underdog. And so that's quite a motivator for me. And we may pick up, my previous work was in the whole area of international human rights and justice and the human trafficking space and rescuing people. So I need a driver. If I don't have a driver, then I won't be here. So that's a bit about me.
That's a good way to look at it, and I think it makes my job a bit easier having this conversation today, because I was going to come on to, obviously, I know your background from your previous experience and then coming into the funeral industry, if you like, and carrying a lot of hats through representing us as funeral directors, certainly with the changing world that we're living in now. But what has your experience of well-being been as you transitioned, I suppose, from the human trafficking, that such a high power role? I can only imagine, the everyday jobs you would have to do, and then coming into being chief executive of SAIF in a completely different industry. Like how did you look after yourself within that, I suppose?
And that's a really good question. I think that burnout is something that we see across the professions that I've seen. I've worked with lawyers, some of the top lawyers in this country and in certainly the Western world, and they push really hard, and there is quite high burnout, and I have not wanted to burn out. So there has to be some safeguards that are put in, and self-awareness is probably the first thing that we have to be aware of, in terms of how we deal with pressure, stress, and how we decompress. I think that's really important, actually, for the people that are closest to us, that we can have a conversation about how we're shaped, if I can use that expression, in terms of so decompressing isn't always, as isn't stopping doing things. It's doing different things that are energizing, so one of the things I enjoy keeping fit, because I know it decompresses me. If I go to the gym, I enjoy exercise, and I do that on a regular basis, and that's part of keeping me level, and that's part of re-energizing me. There's nothing, I get frustrated if I can't go to the gym, and that's a warning sign to me that I need to make space for this, either early morning or it's late at night. And certainly one of the roles I have is I travel around the UK for regional meetings for SAIF members, and that's quite hard when there's quite a bit of traveling and things like that. So I need to build time in outside of that if I'm on a heavy schedule of traveling, that I can decompress.
On that, I think you've put that really nicely about making the time for it. We certainly are an industry where we don't have the time, is quite a famous expression, I now call it. It's quite a regular expression, I suppose, that we say, and making time for it allows us to be who we need to be.
Yeah.
And that sounds as if that's been important for you. And I want to just tie into what you said at the start about, you know, having a drive and a motivator. So if you were travelling around to one of the regional meetings and you hadn't managed to get to the gym or do some form of exercise, do you feel that being driven and motivation wise it kind of dips a little bit because you haven't
does. I think that's a really perceptive point, Katie. I know, like I had in you know, the summer this year, I had 3 weekends on the trot in June where I was working for SAIF. And it was really important that I did those events, and I wanted to, but if I don't take time out, I will go stale. You know, that there is, you to use your expression, there is a dip. So that, you know, you have to build in recharge time. Otherwise, you're going to go like a battery flat.
Yeah. And then, you know, you've done your exercise. How do you feel after you've done it?
Sometimes I'll be really tired and oh, do I go on the cross trainer or do I go for the walk, you know? And I feel I'm really pleased I've achieved it when I've put in, you know, 30 minutes or whatever it is. It doesn't have to be long. I just need to be disciplined. Yeah, and that really helps me. It helps with my mental well-being and, you know, my thought processes. And, you know, when I used to travel internationally, I used to travel to Washington, D.C. every 6 weeks. And wow. I would be in the gym at like, because you'd wake up really early because of the time difference. And I'd be in the gym at sort of 4:30 in the morning. And it wasn't because you'd feel groggy, or it just really helped. I knew I had a very long day ahead, and it just set me for the day, actually. So I think it's very easy to make excuses. It's very easy to get into a habit where you're just overwhelmed. But it's almost like you have to, it's like being squashed between 2 doors. You have to push the doors and you have to make that space. If you don't do it, you're going to crash. If you're going to keep a certain pace up.
Comes back to the burnout.
Yeah.
You know, I'll burn out.
I will burn out if I didn't do this. Yeah.
Yeah. And especially, you know, with regulation changes in Scotland kind of leading the way, I suppose, for England and Wales following, you know, having to deal with the government a lot more, and probably the pressures of, you know, being in those environments that you've been in recently, you know, representing us, you know, how important in that topic in terms of all these changes that we're facing, that when that's brought back to us as SAIF members and as funeral directors to apply these changes and abide by the changes in the code of practices that are going to be Lawson, how important is it for us to really focus on the mental well-being of all of us as individuals now?
I think you're really spot on there with all the changes that the Scottish Government are leading with. It reminds me of the teaching profession, actually, when I sort of first entered business 3 decades ago. You know, and I listened to teachers who were in their sort of 50s and all the changes the UK government were bringing about with teaching, and it was driving them mad, and they just couldn't wait to get out. And then I saw the kind of young guns coming in 20s and 30s, and their mindset, and you'll be familiar with this, there are 2 mindsets that we can have. We can have a fixed mindset. This is the way we've always done it. And if you're going to have that mindset, get ready for trouble. Or you can have a growth mindset. And it's a wonderful illustration between 2 professions where the aviation industry, when there are aviation accidents, they have a growth mindset. They want to understand why things went wrong. Was it mechanical? Was it technological? Was it human error? And then they compared the fixed mindset in the medical world with surgeons who were doing operations and the number of people who died on the operating table, and how the surgeons just, well, that's just the way it is. And they've brought a growth mindset to surgeons, and it's, you know, it's learned so much about how the team works with nurses, anaesthetists, as well as the surgeons. And there were some practical errors where MRA and the cleansing of instruments was being missed. And I think that's true for funeral directors. I think we have to have a mindset to embrace the changes that are about to come. And you know, if you're not prepared to do that, it might be time to stop.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah. Thinking of that, I always remember I did a fear of flying course, and it was a pilot for Virgin Atlantic, and he had one of the massive big 747s or whatever, the big planes at the time, and he tested the planes when the Virgin bought them, and he was always sent out to, he was told go out and break the plane, that was a key test, and he could never break the plane, he could never do it. He's always again, and I always relate that to the mindset of, you know, we can only break when we don't take steps to look after ourselves. So that really ties in nicely to that, and it's a different way of looking at it. And it comes back to, you know, putting into your perspective of, you know, you make time for yourself, you do some exercise, whether it just be for a walk or whatever, and it doesn't need to be long, but it just provides you with kind of de-stress, you know, decompress from whatever type of day that you've had, and you've had the experience behind you now that going to Washington, traveling the world, you know, the 3 weekends in a row that, you know, representing SAIF and knowing how you need to be as Terry before you are Terry, that I would associate with SAIF, if that makes sense. And I think that shows in how positive do you feel at having, you know, you're having the ability to do that, because obviously it doesn't just happen overnight. No. You've developed a way in which to do that. So how does it how the positive change to you, how has it been, the way that you've adapted through that?
So I think that if you want to be a high capacity individual, which means not just in your work, it might be in outside interests that you want to be committed to. It might be voluntary groups or sport or community engagement. I found I have to have space to recharge. I have to feel a sense of fitness. I have to feel that, you know, generally speaking, my diet is a reasonable one. It's a healthy one. I think one thing I'd like to go back to, you know, about what you were saying about, you know, the changes in the funeral profession, particularly in Scotland. I think one of the, again, it's part of our thinking would be, you know, in SAIF Scotland, there's a great sense of, you know, we're called SAIF, and the A stands for Allied. And I think that, you know, there's a great sense of camaraderie amongst members in Scotland, and giving permission for someone you trust from another funeral directors to come in and stress test your business, and actually having permission for them to challenge you as an individual about how are you looking after yourself. And I've got people in my life who I give permission to, that I'm accountable to, about how I balance or try to balance the different moving parts. I think that's really important.
And do you think that, you know, saying allied, I like how you put, I've never thought of that, obviously having the conversation about well-being, looking after ourselves, mentioning the words mental health, that ties into that, because before we've never been able to have such an open conversation that we're able to have now, that there's change within that just as much as every other change we're experiencing. Yeah.
I do see it across the generations. It's really interesting. And, you know, the current generation, sort of from 2013 onwards, is known as Generation Alpha. And then you're part of Generation Z. I'm part of Generation X, which is like mid-60s to, I think it's about 2000-ish. And then there's the boomers, and there's different things about values. And so I'm going to be controversial here. So I know that in some, certainly with the sort of 20s generation, if they don't feel valued, they're going to quit and walk away from what we. So it's really fascinating. Like the boomers, it's all about truth. For the young generation, 2013 onwards, it's about what can we trust, what's safe. And in my generation, it's about what's authentic, what's real. And I'm just trying to think what your generation, I've forgotten what it is, but there are different ways our generate. You know, I remember one of the older founders of SAIF saying, well, in my day, we just got on and did it. And I have the huge respect for the Second World War generation. I mean, there's a book called The Greatest Generation that has come out of the US, and, you know, the way they had to sacrifice. And that's not a word you hear much about often. I mean, funeral directors have to sacrifice a great deal of time and availability 24/7. So they do actually have to sacrifice. And I'm not sure, does the emerging generation want to do the same level of sacrifice? So there are some conversations about, and it might be, yes, they are prepared to do sacrifice, but they also want to survive and be mentally well and not kind of break down through their career. So how do we make that possible for them? I'd be really interested in your thoughts on that.
Yeah. You know, I've obviously I'm second generation, and you know, having that first generation who's got 40 years experience in the industry, and Dad always says to me, you know, I'm that older generation. You know, but I think from seeing me in a position of struggle, in a position of not able to do my work that you know, that your families are really appreciative of, or not having the same level of interest in it, his realisation was, oh, something has to be different here. So then coming back into the industry with different eyes, ears, nose, language, body language, mindset, I think that's spot on. You know, I'm very much that I love World War II. I love reading about it and studying it. And I'd be the same. You know, we can't understand their resilience of what they went through. But I do feel there's a lot of the generation just now that want to have their cake and eat it.
Yeah.
You know, the funeral profession I very much is a lifestyle.
Yeah.
You know, I've grown up where the word sacrifice was normal for us as a family, and still is to a point every day, which doesn't bother us because we're used to it. But at the same time, we know when we need to take a step back to say, listen, I need at least 5 minutes to myself. So I would totally agree with it. I don't think it's controversial. I think we're just in a position we can say it out loud. And I'm sure even somebody listening would be able to relate to that, or maybe use a food for thought process, you know, in the mindset. Because I know if I take time to look after myself, the family that I will then sit with tomorrow who have sadly lost a loved one, I can be as present in what they need me to be for them. If I can't be who I need to be, my family won't get what they need to get in terms of our reputation, our service, everything that my parents have built as a first generation, and that I represent that. So I think it's a key point, a key way of looking at it. But working with each generation, you know, to slowly get everybody in line. And I think as we keep navigating into the future, I think it's going to change again, but it's going to be a more common topic than perhaps it was when I entered the industry full-time 10 years ago.
Yeah, I think sort of the language professionally now is, I think we need to be trauma-informed funeral directors.
Yeah.
That's not just for the clients and families, it's for our staff team. And there's a lovely expression that's used about, I forget who put it, you know, people will remember you not by what you said, but how you made them feel. And I, you know, I think it's so, you know, are we owners and employers who want to have staff, and we look for loyalty, and we look for dedication, we look for competency, we look for a can-do attitude in our staff teams and our colleagues. But staff and colleagues are looking for clear direction, for understanding and empathy, as well as reward and support. So there's kind of an exchange that needs to go on here, isn't there? And I think part of the trauma-informed, you know, when you see you know, I think in the human trafficking space where we saw, you know, victims of trafficking and the horror stories, you know, that some children and women and men faced, there is secondary trauma by just hearing these stories. You may not have been
Mm-hmm.
there. And that's true for funeral directors, arrangers, where you hear of a very sad loss. And, you know, part of being trauma informed is actually maybe you just need time, as you say, out, whether it's 10 minutes or maybe more, to go for a walk and just gather yourself so you can be better, as you say, for the next family you meet.
Yeah. It needs to be like that. And I suppose it comes on to what I wanted to ask about, you know, the times that you've maybe struggled, you know, what helped you get through that struggle? What were your lessons from those struggles?
I think the lessons for me were, I suppose, was determination. So I made a conscious decision that I was going to survive. And that might sound a bit odd or twee, but I was, and I think sort of the role models in my life have been very helpful, where I've seen those nearest and dearest to me go through quite a bit of tribulation. And, you know, how I think there are things like compartmentalizing things. So when we're, you know, in terms of, if you think of our minds and our lives as a house, there may be some really difficult things we're going through, and we need to put, sometimes we have to operate daily, and it might be that we put some of the trauma in a room and we close and lock the door so we can get on and live, and then we go back and attend to that. I'm not saying we don't deal with it, but there's a time and a place. So that's been very helpful for me, where I was going through a season and I had to put that and find a safe space. Having close people around me who I knew loved me, who were there for me, who listened. That's really important. I think having fun. So I'm a great believer in laughter. So I would, if I know I was going through a very stressful time, I would deliberately watch comedy. I love funny stories anyway. And that just, chemically, the endorphins and so forth will change the way you think and the way you feel. So I would deliberately do certain things, as well as, exercise or chill or go and spend time with people that I really enjoyed. So those were kind of some of the simple things I did.
And they help be your motivator and your drive to then go back into that stressful situation that might have to continue at another point.
Yeah, and I think, we have to accept we go through shadow times, shadow lands, and we just have, it's going to be difficult. Life isn't always fluffy and nice. And it's okay to say you're not okay. But I'm here, I'm breathing, and I'm doing what I need to do. And so I think that's how I personally have dealt with difficult times. And it's been very, satisfying to come through the other side. And I think that's part of, my sort of values. Valuing people is really important. And, I think one of the challenges in the funeral sector is the historic style of leadership as being command and control, which is, if you think about command and control, it's either in a military context, it could be in a police emergency situation, or it could be in fire, ambulance services. And so there's an appropriate time, when a funeral director operative goes out, command and control, this is what we need to do to this situation, this family. But, that's in that context. In the way we operate a business, I struggle with that style of leadership in a day-to-day operation. I think that's an emergency style operation. It should be far more collaborative and collegiate and empowering.
And I think it relates into when they talk about the responses of our behaviours, when they talk about, are we reactive or proactive? So it would definitely come down to the reactive state.
Yeah.
And I think that it comes back to, saying about some of the founders of SAIF, that was the known style. That's not singling anyone out at all. That's just a fact of what the industry was at the time. But I think now that it's changing, we've got less of that. There is still some of that in situations and things, but it's less of that, and being proactive can allow, differences. And I suppose it brings on to the question that I've been asking everyone. I think it ties in nicely. And I know that you know the question that I'm going to ask you because you've heard it before, but for anyone listening to our conversation today, Terry, is there any advice, any tips, or any messages that might help someone, or just give them something that they could take away from us having our conversation?
That's a hard question, actually. I would say find your niche of how you are restored and energized. Find the way what gives you respite and recharges you, and it's going to be different. So for some people I'd say, will you stop looking at your phone? And for others, actually, gaming, or that's going to energize you. Fine, do it. If there's a community, so pay attention to being your best when you're working, but also finding time when you're best for your loved ones, for your friends, your closest friends. So pay attention to, if we're reckless with our time in terms of staying up late and not eating well and not exercise, we're going to be feeling rubbish. And we need to help ourselves. So it's finding what, and it's having the courage to step out and try different things. So I would say find those gaps that can, where they talk about a power nap, and I'm not that I can practice it always, but my father, he suffered with a very bad back in his midlife right through to his end, and he learned where he would have a nap for 45 minutes. And, and I think having a 2-minute nap where you just is so empowering. And you would know this as a personal trainer.
Mm-hmm.
And it's finding that sort of quiet space. And it might be listening to some music. It might be just stillness and solitude.
At times I've certainly put my head on the desk.
Yeah.
Just in a minute. I have been known, this is probably a confession, more than anything, I have taken a nap in the office just to go and take a few minutes. I can't get away from the environment, but just a little 5 minutes on the sofa that we've got in one of the other rooms. So yeah, it's really powerful. And again, just that little time can just energize you enough for whatever you've got going on for the following hours left in the day. So, I think we've highlighted a lot there. And I've got a lot of food for thought walking away from today's conversation for sure. But Terry, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been a pleasure to have a chat, and hopefully anyone listening can take something away from it.
Thank you, Katie. Really appreciate all you're doing to help us find wellness.
Thank you.